The first crop circles appeared overnight. Simple at first, just a few flattened rings in the fields outside Hollow's End. The townsfolk barely paid them any mind. Just oddities, whispered about at the diner, dismissed as the work of bored teenagers. Then more appeared. Larger. More complex. Spirals and symbols no one could decipher. The town's lone newspaper ran a story about them, but there was no panic, no real concern. Just curiosity. That changed when the first person disappeared. Old Henry Wilcox, a farmer whose land had been one of the first to be marked by the strange formations, was nowhere to be found. His truck sat in the driveway, keys still in the ignition. His front door was unlocked. His breakfast, 2 eggs, a strip of bacon, a slice of toast, was left untouched on the table. Even his reading glasses rested on the counter, folded neatly beside the morning paper. There was no sign of struggle. No blood. No footprints leading away. It was as if he had simply ceased to exist. The town searched. Volunteers combed through his fields, his barn, the dense woods beyond. The sheriff organized search parties, but after 2 days, they found nothing. Then another vanished. And another. Each time, the same eerie scene, a home left perfectly undisturbed, meals half-eaten, beds unrumpled, doors left unlocked. It was only when the first one returned that the real fear began. 3 days after old Henry Wilcox vanished, he came back. It was just before dawn when his neighbor, Tom Grayson, saw the figure walking down the dirt road toward town. Henry moved stiffly, his gait unnatural, as if he were unfamiliar with his own limbs. His clothes were the same ones he had disappeared in, but they were oddly pristine, no dirt, no wrinkles, not even a trace of sweat. Tom called out to him, but Henry didn't respond. He just kept walking. By the time the sheriff arrived, Henry was standing in the center of town, staring blankly ahead. His face was slack, his eyes distant and glassy, like a doll's. He did not acknowledge the growing crowd around him. When asked where he had been, he only muttered one thing before falling silent altogether. "They are coming." The words sent a ripple of unease through the gathered townsfolk. Dr. Lowell took Henry into his clinic, but no matter what tests he ran, everything seemed normal. Physically, Henry Wilcox was fine. But something was wrong. He did not eat. He did not drink. He did not react to touch or sound. He simply sat in a chair, motionless, staring at the wall. That night, Tom Grayson disappeared. The next morning, he returned the same way, walking stiffly into town at dawn, eyes blank, lips parted in a silent whisper. "They are coming." And then, the disappearances grew worse. The disappearances spread like a sickness. Every night, more homes were left eerily undisturbed, their occupants simply gone. Every morning, more of them returned, walking stiffly into town, eyes vacant, whispering the same chilling phrase. "They are coming." By the end of the week, nearly a dozen people had vanished and returned. They did not speak beyond those 3 words. They did not sleep. They did not eat. They only sat in their homes or stood in the streets, staring at nothing, unblinking. Their families tried to reach them, to shake them from their trance, but nothing worked. Then, the screaming began. Mrs. Calloway, whose husband had been taken and returned 2 nights before, woke to the sound of his screams, high, thin wails, like an animal caught in a trap. By the time she reached him, he was curled into a shaking ball on the kitchen floor, clawing at his own skin, his mouth stretched open in a silent, gaping horror. Then, as suddenly as it began, it stopped. He stood, straightened his clothes, and returned to his place by the window, staring out into the darkness. He did not acknowledge his wife's sobbing, did not react as she pleaded for him to tell her what was happening. And then, one by one, the others began to scream, too. Every night, without fail. And the crop circles continued to spread. By the second week, Hollow's End felt like a town on the brink of collapse. More than 24 people had vanished and returned. The same vacant expressions. The same whispered warning. And every night, without fail, the screaming. The sheriff stopped keeping track of the disappearances, stopped knocking on doors to check on the returned. There was no point. Whatever had taken them had left something else behind, something less than human. Meanwhile, the crop circles grew. The once simple rings had transformed into vast, interwoven patterns stretching across acres of farmland. They were impossibly intricate, with sharp angles and sweeping curves too precise for any man to have made overnight. Satellite images taken by a news crew revealed something even more disturbing: the formations weren't random. They were connected, each new design an extension of the last, as if forming a message, one written on the land itself. Then, one evening, the sky split open. A strange light descended over the fields. It wasn't like lightning, nor was it the pale glow of the moon. This was something else, something wrong. It shimmered and pulsed in unnatural hues, a shifting spectrum of colors that had no names. The air itself vibrated, heavy with a sound too deep to hear but felt in the bones. And the returned, the hollowed-out husks that had once been neighbors, friends, family, turned in unison toward the fields. They stepped forward, as if answering a call. And one by one, they began to walk toward the light. The people of Hollow's End watched in stunned horror as the returned moved toward the glowing fields. They walked in perfect unison, their feet dragging through the dirt, their blank eyes locked on the pulsing radiance ahead. The ones who still remained untouched, the ones who had not yet vanished and returned, screamed their names, begged them to stop, to turn around. They did not. Not even when their loved ones clutched at their arms, yanked at their clothes, pleaded through sobs. The return simply kept moving, slow and deliberate, as if caught in the pull of some unseen force. And then, they reached the fields. The light did not flicker or waver, it consumed. The moment the first of them stepped into the swirling patterns of the crop circles, their bodies disintegrated into shimmering dust. No sound. No struggle. Just, gone. One by one, they vanished, dissolving into the air like mist in the morning sun. The ground beneath them began to shift. The flattened stalks of wheat, barley, and corn twisted, reshaping themselves as the formations evolved, an ever-growing message expanding with each new sacrifice. The sky pulsed brighter. And then, silence. The light flickered once, twice, then blinked out. The night returned, cold and dark. The field stood empty, save for the shifting crop circles. The air still carried the weight of something vast, something watching. By morning, the town was smaller. Dozens gone. No trace left behind. But the worst part came at dawn, when a new figure appeared on the horizon, walking stiffly into town. The sheriff's own wife. She had vanished weeks ago. She had returned. And her lips moved with the same chilling whisper. "They are here." The sheriff dropped to his knees when he saw her. His wife, Claire, had disappeared 17 days ago. She was one of the first. He had searched for her, called every nearby town, knocked on every door. And now she was back, standing in the middle of Main Street, her body rigid, her skin pallid under the morning sun. She wasn't the only one. More figures emerged from the misty fields, all those who had walked into the light the night before. They returned in silence, their faces empty, their movements unnatural, wrong. Their clothes were unchanged, still pristine, as if untouched by time. Their eyes, lifeless, yet filled with something. A knowledge no human should hold. They stood in a perfect line, facing the townspeople, unmoving. The wind barely stirred. Then, in one slow, synchronized movement, they all turned their heads toward the sky. The sheriff's wife opened her mouth. Her voice came in a rasp, as if she hadn't used it in years, yet it was clear. "You will be chosen." A ripple of terror passed through the crowd. Mothers clutched their children. Shopkeepers backed away, slamming doors behind them. Some ran. Others stood frozen, caught in the web of dread. And then, the return smiled. It was the first expression they had shown since coming back. But there was no warmth in it, no joy, just a slow, unsettling curl of the lips, as if mimicking something they had once known but no longer understood. The sheriff reached for his gun. His hands trembled as he pointed it at Claire. She did not react. None of them did. And then, from the depths of the fields, the light returned. It did not rise into the sky this time. It did not pulse from above. It came from beneath the earth. Something was waking up. The ground trembled. Not a sharp quake, but a deep, pulsing vibration, like a slow, enormous heartbeat buried beneath the soil. Dust rose in thin spirals from the cracked roads, and the fields beyond Hollow's End swayed though there was no wind. The returned did not move. They stood motionless, eyes fixed skyward, smiles still stretched unnaturally across their faces. Then, one by one, they began to hum. Low at first, barely more than a vibration in the throat. But as more joined in, the sound deepened, thickened, filling the air like an oppressive fog. It wasn't a song, nor was it a chant, it was something far worse. A resonance that crawled into the bones, wormed into the skull. People clamped their hands over their ears, but it did nothing. The sound was inside them, rattling their ribs, pressing against their minds. The sheriff dropped to one knee, his head pounding, the world spinning. His wife still stood before him, her lips unmoving, yet the sound poured from her, as if she were a vessel, an open conduit to something far beyond human understanding. Then, the earth split open. It wasn't an explosion, not a violent rupture. It was deliberate, a slow parting of the soil, like lips peeling back in anticipation. And from the darkness below, something began to rise. It was not a creature. Not in the way the mind expected. There was no flesh, no eyes, no distinguishable form, only shape and movement, shifting like liquid shadow. Its edges blurred, constantly reforming, as if it refused to be bound by the limitations of the physical world. The humming grew louder. People screamed. But their voices were small, insignificant against the vastness of the thing unfolding before them. The sheriff forced himself to his feet, but his legs were weak. His gun felt useless in his grip. There was no fighting this. No stopping it. And then, the returned finally spoke, not in unison, not in whispers, but as individuals, their voices overlapping in a cacophony of chilling certainty. The harvest begins. The blackness surged forward. The blackness moved like living smoke, unfurling from the gaping wound in the earth. It was not mist, nor shadow, nor anything that belonged in this world. It writhed and pulsed, stretching out in tendrils that slithered along the cracked roads and coiled around the buildings of Hollow's End. The townspeople ran. Some bolted for their homes, slamming doors behind them as if wood and brick could stop the thing that was spreading. Others fled toward their cars, tires skidding on dirt roads, but it didn't matter. The blackness was faster. It did not creep, it snapped, closing the distance between itself and its prey in an instant. A man sprinting toward the church was caught mid-stride. The moment the darkness touched him, he froze. His body jerked, spine arching unnaturally as his mouth stretched open in a soundless scream. His skin paled, his veins darkened, and his eyes rolled back until there was nothing left but milky white. Then, as if released from invisible strings, he dropped to his knees, his body still, his breathing shallow. And his lips curled into that same eerie, unnatural smile. More were taken. A woman and her child tried to flee down the alley behind the general store, but the tendrils found them. Their bodies stiffened in unison, heads snapping back as the color drained from their faces. The child's tiny hands twitched before going still. They did not die. They simply changed. The sheriff watched in horror from where he stood. His fingers trembled against the grip of his gun, sweat dripping into his eyes. His wife, Claire, was still standing in front of him, watching him. Waiting. "You will be chosen," she whispered again, her voice barely human. The blackness lashed toward him. He turned to run. The moment his feet moved, Claire's head snapped unnaturally to the side, her smile widening into something grotesque, her teeth too white, too sharp. "You cannot run from them." The darkness reached for him. And the world went black. The blackness swallowed the sheriff whole. It was not like drowning. Not like suffocating. It was worse. The moment it touched him, his body locked in place, his limbs rigid, frozen in mid-motion. Cold seeped into his bones, but it wasn't the cold of winter, it was emptiness, a void pouring into him, draining everything that made him him. His thoughts unraveled. His memories flickered. He could feel something reaching inside his mind, sifting through his past like fingers rifling through pages of a book. Claire. His wife. The smell of her hair in the mornings. The way she laughed when she thought no one was listening. Gone. The town. His childhood. His mother's voice singing to him in the summer heat. Gone. Everything that had made him alive was being pulled away, leaving nothing but a hollow shell. A vessel. Somewhere in the blackness, he heard them. The others. They had been taken too. He felt their presence, countless souls stripped of identity, reduced to whispers. They were not dead. They were waiting. Waiting to be filled. A voice, vast and unearthly, coiled through the void like smoke. It did not speak with words, but with understanding, a thought pressed so deeply into his mind that it became his own. The flesh is temporary. The mind is a doorway. The sheriff's body trembled as something pushed against that doorway, something vast and old and hungry. And then, light. Blinding. Overwhelming. The void shrieked in fury as it was torn away from him, and suddenly, the sheriff was falling, his body crashing onto the cold dirt of Hollow's End. He gasped, sucking in air like a drowning man. His vision swam, his limbs weak and trembling. He was back. But not all of him. Something had been taken. Something had been left behind. And as he struggled to his knees, looking around at the others who had fallen, the ones who had been taken and returned, he realized the truth. They weren't people anymore. They were seeds. Waiting to grow. The sheriff's body was his, but it no longer felt like home. Something else was inside him now. Not a voice, not a presence, just emptiness, a hollow space where something vital had been carved away. His memories were still there, but they felt distant, like old photographs viewed through warped glass. Around him, the others who had been taken stirred. They rose from the dirt one by one, moving with eerie precision, as if waking from the same dream. Their faces were blank. Their movements slow. But their eyes, God, their eyes, were wrong. No fear. No confusion. Just waiting. The town was silent. The blackness had receded, curling back into the open wound in the earth. The tendrils of shadow slithered down into the abyss, withdrawing like an animal satisfied with its meal. And the light, that terrible, pulsing glow that had consumed the fields, was gone. But the damage was done. The town was smaller now. The homes of those who had been taken were still untouched, eerily perfect, as if the people inside had simply ceased to exist. Doors left ajar. Meals unfinished. Lives abandoned. The ones who remained, the untouched, stood frozen in horror, their gazes flicking between the returned and the empty spaces where loved ones should have been. And then, Claire stepped forward. She had been gone the longest. She had vanished 17 days ago, yet there was no sign of starvation, no frailty in her limbs. She looked the same, exactly the same, only her eyes betrayed the truth. She turned her head toward the sheriff, her mouth twitching at the corners. The smile. "It has begun," she whispered. The others, the seeds, whispered the words along with her, their voices overlapping in a soft, rustling symphony. "It has begun." The sheriff's breath hitched. The hollow inside him pulsed, and for the first time since he awoke, he understood. They had not been spared. They had been marked. Not all crops are harvested immediately. Some are left to grow. To ripen. And the ones that remained in Hollow's End were no longer just people. They were waiting. Waiting for the next phase. Waiting to become the end, for now.